Hey, monkey! Wrong jungle! The zoo's that way! Officer Bradley Morrison's cruel voice exploded across the courthouse plaza. He jabbed his finger like a spear, pointing away from the building. The distinguished black man in the expensive charcoal suit stopped dead on the marble steps. Morrison's partner, Jake Stevens, erupted in hysterical laughter, banging the car door with his fist. Two officers nearby bent over, gasping and wheezing. "Look at Mr. Fancy Pants! Someone's lost!" Morrison threw his head back, cackling like a hyena. The other officers made monkey noises, scratching under their arms. Passers-by stopped, some filming with phones, others looking away in disgust. The man turned slowly. His steady gaze locked onto Morrison's twisted face. Have you ever witnessed someone judge a book by its cover, only to discover they were holding a mirror to their own ignorance? Judge Nathaniel Washington had always believed that justice lived in the details. At 45, he understood that truth emerged not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of preparation. His morning routine never varied. Coffee at 5:30 a.m., black and bitter. Case files spread across his kitchen table like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled. The suburban house felt too big since his wife passed 3 years ago, but their twin daughters, Sophia and Maya, still called it home during college breaks. Today's stack contained something different. Police misconduct cases, civil rights violations, a federal mandate demanding accountability from Metro City's police department. The irony wasn't lost on him. A black federal judge tasked with cleaning up a system that had failed people who looked like him for generations. The radio crackled from his countertop. Breaking news this morning. Protesters gathered outside Metro City Courthouse, demanding police reform following recent allegations of racial profiling. Washington sipped his coffee, scanning incident reports. Officer Bradley Morrison's name appeared repeatedly. 15-year veteran. Multiple civilian complaints. 0 disciplinary actions. The pattern painted itself clearly across the pages. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. "Dad, be careful today. Saw the news about the protests. Love you." Washington smiled, straightening his burgundy tie. His daughters worried about him walking into courtrooms where he might be the only black face in a sea of blue uniforms. But someone had to do it. Someone had to stand in that gap between law and justice. The drive downtown took 20 minutes through tree-lined streets that gradually shifted from suburban calm to urban tension. Construction barriers forced traffic into single lanes. Police cruisers seemed to multiply at every intersection. Metro City's federal courthouse rose like a monument to marble and glass. Built in 1923, it had witnessed decades of legal battles that shaped the nation. Today, it would witness something else entirely. Protesters lined the sidewalks, holding signs demanding accountability. Justice for all and reform now bobbed above a diverse crowd of citizens who had grown tired of waiting for change. News vans clustered like metal vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward a cloudless sky. Washington parked 3 blocks away, choosing to walk the final distance. His leather briefcase contained more than legal documents. It held the hopes of every person who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. The morning air carried sounds of the waking city. Traffic hummed along busy streets. Construction workers hammered against steel. Somewhere in the distance, police sirens wailed their familiar song. Officer Morrison was beginning his shift 6 blocks away, completely unaware that his world was about to collide with the very man he would soon humiliate. Morrison's patrol car reeked of stale coffee and cigarettes. His partner Stevens climbed into the passenger seat, already uncomfortable with the older officer's crude jokes about the protesters. "Look at all these troublemakers," Morrison sneered, adjusting his rearview mirror. "Give them an inch. They take a mile." Stevens said nothing, focusing on his radio instead. At 28, he had joined the force hoping to make a difference. 5 years later, he found himself partnered with a man who represented everything wrong with policing. But speaking up meant career suicide. The blue wall of silence protected officers like Morrison while crushing those who dared to challenge it. The department's morning briefing had been tense. Chief Rodriguez warned about media attention and reminded officers to follow protocol. But Morrison rolled his eyes, whispering to Stevens about political correctness and real police work. Washington climbed the courthouse steps, unaware that Morrison's patrol car was circling the block. The marble felt solid beneath his Italian leather shoes. Each step carried the weight of preparation and purpose. The building's security guards recognized him immediately. "Good morning, Your Honor," they nodded respectfully. Washington returned their greeting with genuine warmth. Respect, he had learned, was earned through consistency rather than demanded through title. His chambers waited on the third floor, overlooking the plaza where protesters continued their peaceful demonstration. The irony struck him again. He would spend the day reviewing cases about police misconduct while officers patrolled the streets below, most of them good people trying to serve their community with honor. But not all of them. Morrison's radio crackled with routine calls, noise complaints, fender benders. Nothing interesting enough to satisfy his need for action. He preferred the old days when police work meant respect through fear rather than community partnership and de-escalation training. The collision course was set. Two men, two worldviews, two different definitions of justice about to intersect in ways neither could imagine. Washington arranged his files, preparing for a day of careful deliberation. Morrison scanned the streets, looking for someone to stop. Neither man knew that history was about to unfold in the most unexpected way possible. Judge Washington's sedan moved smoothly through downtown traffic, its silver paint gleaming under the midday sun. He had left the courthouse for lunch, choosing to drive rather than walk through the crowd of protesters still gathered outside. The car was modest, a 3-year-old Camry that reflected his practical nature rather than his federal salary. 2 blocks from his favorite sandwich shop, flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror. Officer Morrison's patrol car lurched behind him, siren whooping once before falling silent. Morrison had spotted the well-dressed black man through the sedan's rear window and felt that familiar itch. A nice car in a nice neighborhood meant one thing to Morrison. Someone was where they didn't belong. Washington's heart sank as he recognized the routine. Hands visible on the steering wheel, no sudden movements. Remain calm. The same instructions he had given his daughters countless times echoed in his mind. Morrison approached the driver's side window with his hand resting casually on his service weapon. His swagger radiated authority and something else: anticipation. Stevens emerged from the passenger seat, already sensing this would be different from their usual stops. "License and registration," Morrison barked without explanation. His voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Washington reached slowly for his wallet, narrating each movement. "I'm reaching for my license in my jacket pocket." His voice remained steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. Morrison snatched the documents, barely glancing at them before fixing Washington with a cold stare. "What's a guy like you doing driving around a neighborhood like this?" "I work nearby," Washington replied evenly. The truth, but not the whole truth. Something told him to keep his judicial status private for now. "Work?" Morrison's laugh was sharp and ugly. "What kind of work?" "Delivering something you shouldn't be delivering." Stevens shifted uncomfortably behind his partner, watching the interaction with growing unease. Pedestrians began slowing their pace, sensing the tension crackling in the air. Several pulled out their phones. Morrison's eyes swept over Washington's expensive suit, the leather briefcase visible on the passenger seat, the small American flag pin on his lapel. Everything about this man suggested success and dignity, which only fueled Morrison's resentment. "Step out of the vehicle," Morrison commanded, his voice rising. "I need to conduct a search." "On what grounds?" Washington asked calmly, though his legal mind was already cataloging the constitutional violations unfolding. Morrison's face flushed red. "Don't get smart with me, boy." I said, "Get out." The slur hung in the air like poison. Stevens took a half-step back, glancing nervously at the growing crowd of witnesses. Phones were definitely recording now. Washington complied slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of experiencing this exact scenario had taught him that resistance, even legal resistance, could turn deadly in seconds. "Hands behind your back," Morrison snapped, already reaching for his handcuffs. "For what crime?" Washington's voice remained level, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but a deeper understanding of what was happening. Morrison spun Washington around roughly, pressing him against the car's warm metal. Suspicious behavior, possible drug activity, resisting an officer. The handcuffs clicked into place with mechanical precision. Washington felt the cold metal bite into his wrists as Morrison tightened them deliberately past comfort. The violation was both physical and spiritual, a reduction of human dignity to its most basic elements. "Look what we got here," Morrison announced loudly, playing to the gathering audience. His voice carried theatrical mockery. "Another upstanding citizen just minding his own business." A businessman stopped mid-stride on the sidewalk, his face twisted with confusion. "What did he do?" he called out. Morrison ignored him, forcing Washington away from the car. The judge's expensive shoes scraped against the concrete as Morrison guided him toward the curb. "Sit," Morrison commanded, pointing at the sidewalk like he was training a dog. Washington lowered himself to the concrete, the position designed for maximum humiliation. A successful man reduced to sitting on a sidewalk in handcuffs while pedestrians gawked. Stevens watched his partner perform, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. "Morrison, maybe we should call this in," he suggested weakly. "Call what in?" Morrison shot back. "Just a routine stop." "Nothing to see here, folks." But there was plenty to see. Morrison kicked at Washington's legs, forcing them to spread wider. "Comfortable down there? Not used to sitting on curbs, are you? Probably more of a country club type." A woman across the street pulled out her phone, starting to record. "This is wrong," she muttered to her companion. Morrison noticed the phone and puffed out his chest. "Police business, ma'am. Keep moving unless you want to join him." The threat only made more people stop. Office workers on lunch breaks gathered in clusters, their phones creating a digital jury. A food truck vendor left his window to watch. Construction workers set down their tools. Washington said nothing, but his legal mind continued working. False imprisonment, unlawful detention, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, civil rights violations under federal statute. The list grew longer with each passing minute. "Cat got your tongue?" Morrison taunted, squatting down to Washington's eye level. "Where's all that education now? Bet you went to some fancy college, didn't you?" Stevens knelt beside his partner, lowering his voice. "Morrison, this doesn't feel right." "The guy was just driving. He's cooperating. Maybe we should let him go." Morrison's eyes blazed with something beyond anger, a desperate need to maintain control in a world that was slowly changing around him. "He fits the description," he lied smoothly. "What description?" Stevens pressed. "The one from this morning's briefing. Armed robbery suspect, black male, well-dressed, expensive car." Morrison's lies came easily, polished by years of practice. Washington's eyebrows raised slightly. He knew no such briefing had occurred. He had been in meetings with the police chief about these exact kinds of fabrications. A young black teenager in the crowd pulled out his phone, broadcasting live on social media. "Y'all seeing this? They got this man in a suit sitting on the curb for nothing. This is exactly what we're talking about." Morrison noticed the teenager and felt his authority challenged. "You got a problem, kid? Want to join your friend down there?" The teenager held up his hands but kept recording. "No, sir, just exercising my constitutional rights." The irony wasn't lost on Washington. A teenager understood constitutional law better than the officer violating it. Morrison stood and began pacing, his hand never leaving his weapon. "Search the vehicle, Stevens. Let's see what Mr. Fancy Pants is really up to." "We need a warrant for that," Stevens said quietly. "We have probable cause," Morrison snapped. "Drug investigation. Suspicious behavior, resisting arrest." "He hasn't resisted anything," a woman in the crowd called out. Morrison spun toward her, his face red with rage. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back, or you'll be interfering with police business." The woman stepped back but continued recording. Her phone captured Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior, his partner's obvious discomfort, and Washington's dignified silence. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Morrison hissed, returning to Washington. Sitting there all calm and collected. "Like you own the place." Washington met his gaze steadily. "I think we're all equal under the law, Officer Morrison." The use of his name startled Morrison briefly. He had forgotten about the name tag on his uniform. But he recovered quickly, standing and adjusting his belt with practiced authority. "Equal!" Morrison laughed bitterly, his voice rising for the crowd to hear. "That's rich coming from someone sitting in handcuffs on a curb." The crowd continued growing. Office workers, store clerks, students, even some off-duty police officers who looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Their collective presence created an energy that Stevens could feel, but Morrison remained oblivious to. A news van turned the corner, its satellite dish visible above the traffic. Someone had called the media. Washington closed his eyes briefly, thinking of his daughters. This was the America they would inherit, one where success and dignity could be stripped away by prejudice and a badge. But it was also an America where witnesses gathered, where phones recorded truth, where justice might still be possible. He just had to survive what came next. Morrison's radio crackled with static as backup units responded to his call. 2 additional patrol cars rounded the corner, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. The cavalry had arrived, and Morrison felt his confidence surge. "What do we have here?" Officer Davis asked as he stepped out of the first backup unit. His eyes swept over the scene. Washington still sitting handcuffed on the curb, Morrison pacing like a caged animal, Stevens looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Drug investigation," Morrison announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Suspect was acting suspicious, possible narcotics in the vehicle." Washington's legal mind noted the escalating lies. First, it was suspicious behavior, then armed robbery, now drugs. Morrison was painting himself into a corner with each fabrication. Officer Rodriguez emerged from the second patrol car, younger than the others, but already showing signs of the cynicism that infected the department. "Need us to search the vehicle?" he asked eagerly. "Absolutely," Morrison replied, his chest swelling with authority. "Full search. This one thinks he's special." Stevens tried one more time. "Morrison, maybe we should just issue a warning and—" "Stevens, shut up and do your job!" Morrison snapped. "Search the car." Now. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people. Office workers held phones at eye level. A street artist sketched the scene from across the road. The food truck vendor had abandoned his customers to watch the spectacle unfold. Washington watched Stevens approach his sedan with obvious reluctance. The young officer opened the driver's door and began searching through the glove compartment, his movements hesitant and apologetic. "Find anything yet?" Morrison called out theatrically. Stevens pulled out the vehicle registration, insurance papers, and a small emergency flashlight. Nothing remotely suspicious. "Just normal stuff," he reported quietly. Morrison's face darkened. He needed something, anything, to justify this escalating situation. Check under the seats. Trunk. These guys are clever about hiding things. Rodriguez joined the search, pulling seat cushions forward and running his hands along the car's interior. Davis opened the trunk, revealing only emergency supplies and a spare tire. "Maybe we should check his briefcase," Rodriguez suggested, pointing to the leather case still visible on the passenger seat. Washington's heart sank. His briefcase contained case files, judicial notes, and documents that would immediately reveal his identity. He wasn't ready for that revelation yet. Something told him to let this play out, to experience the full scope of what countless others had endured. Morrison seized the briefcase like it contained evidence of major crimes. He set it on the car's hood and popped the latches with dramatic flair. Legal documents spilled out, case files with federal court letterhead, a judicial calendar marked with hearing dates. Morrison's eyes scanned the papers, but his mind was too focused on finding drugs or weapons to process what he was actually seeing. "What's all this legal mumbo-jumbo?" Morrison asked, waving a court document in the air. "Are you some kind of lawyer or something?" Washington remained silent, watching Morrison handle federal judicial documents like they were trash. Each rough movement was another violation, another piece of evidence for the civil rights lawsuit that would inevitably follow. "Probably ambulance chaser," Davis chimed in, earning chuckles from Rodriguez. "Look at this fancy briefcase. Bet he's one of those lawyers always suing cops." The irony was lost on them completely. They were manhandling documents from cases involving police misconduct while committing their own acts of misconduct. A woman in the crowd called out, "This is harassment!" "That man hasn't done anything wrong." Morrison spun toward her, his patience finally snapping. "Lady, if you don't back up right now, you're going to jail too." "For what?" she demanded, holding her ground. "Interfering with police business. Obstruction." "Pick a charge!" Morrison's voice had risen to a near shout. Stevens stepped between Morrison and the crowd, his hands raised peacefully. "Everyone just needs to calm down," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. Morrison turned his attention back to Washington, who sat with perfect posture despite the handcuffs cutting into his wrists. The judge's calm demeanor only fueled Morrison's rage further. "You know what I think?" Morrison announced, circling Washington like a predator. "I think Mr. A fancy lawyer here was chasing this neighborhood, looking for houses to rob, or maybe selling drugs to rich white folks." The racial coding in his words was unmistakable. Several people in the crowd shook their heads in disgust. Washington finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Officer Morrison, you're making a mistake." "Oh, I'm making a mistake?" Morrison laughed harshly. "The only mistake I made was not searching you more thoroughly." Without warning, Morrison grabbed Washington by the shoulders and forced him to stand. "Spread your legs wider." Arms out. The pat-down was aggressive and invasive, designed more for humiliation than safety. Morrison's hands searched every pocket, every fold of Washington's expensive suit. The violation was intentional and thorough. "What's this?" Morrison asked, pulling out Washington's wallet again. This time he opened it completely, dumping the contents onto the car's hood. Credit cards scattered across the metal surface. Cash fluttered in the breeze. Morrison picked up each item, examining it like evidence. When he reached the small leather folder containing Washington's judicial ID, he barely glanced at it before tossing it aside. "Lots of cash for someone with an honest job," Morrison observed, counting the bills with exaggerated interest. "Where does a guy like you get money like this?" "I work for a living," Washington replied simply. "Doing what? Selling drugs? Pimping? Running numbers?" Morrison's suggestions grew more offensive with each word. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Phones continued recording. A news van had parked across the street, its crew setting up equipment. Rodriguez found Washington's cell phone and handed it to Morrison. "Check his contacts. See who he's been talking to." Morrison scrolled through the phone's call log, his face twisted with concentration. Names like Chief Justice Roberts and Attorney General Williams meant nothing to him. He was looking for street names, gang affiliations, drug dealers. "Lots of government numbers," Morrison noted suspiciously. "You working with the feds?" Informant, maybe? Stevens watched his partner's behavior with growing horror. This had crossed every line imaginable. Morrison, we need to wrap this up. The sergeant's going to want a report. Let him want one, Morrison shot back. I'm conducting a thorough investigation here. Davis and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Even they were beginning to recognize that Morrison had gone too far. But the blue wall of silence held firm. No cop would openly challenge another in front of civilians. A teenager in the crowd had been live streaming the entire encounter. His broadcast had attracted hundreds of viewers, their comments flowing across his screen in real-time outrage. "This is going viral," the teenager announced. "People are sharing this everywhere." Morrison's head snapped toward the kid. "Turn that camera off right now." "It's a public street," the teenager replied confidently. "First Amendment, officer." Morrison took a step toward the crowd, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. The gesture sent a ripple of fear through the gathered people, but also strengthened their resolve. Washington watched the scene unfold with the analytical mind of a federal judge. Morrison was unraveling, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Each action was another violation, another count in the eventual federal indictment. "Officer Morrison," Washington said quietly, "I strongly advise you to reconsider your course of action." Morrison whirled around, his face purple with rage. "You advise me? You don't advise anybody from down there on that curb." He forced Washington to sit again, this time pressing down on his shoulders with unnecessary force. The concrete was rough against Washington's expensive suit, each moment of contact another indignity in a growing list. "Check his shoes," Morrison ordered Rodriguez. "Sometimes they hide drugs in the soles." Rodriguez knelt reluctantly and examined Washington's Italian leather shoes. Nothing. Of course there was nothing. Morrison's radio squawked with chatter from dispatch. Other units were requesting his status. The sergeant was asking for updates. The walls were beginning to close in, but Morrison was too deep into his performance to stop now. "You know what I think happened here?" Morrison announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the theatrical quality of someone who had lost all perspective. "I think our friend here thought he could drive through this neighborhood without anybody noticing. Thought his fancy suit would protect him. The racist implications hung in the air like toxic smoke. Even Davis and Rodriguez looked uncomfortable now. Stevens made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Morrison, let's just process him at the station and sort this out there." Morrison's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Let's take Mr. Fancy Pants for a ride." Washington closed his eyes as Morrison grabbed his arm roughly, pulling him toward the patrol car. The crowd protested loudly, their voices creating a chorus of disapproval that followed him to the vehicle. As Morrison pushed Washington's head down and shoved him into the back seat, the judge caught sight of his scattered legal documents still spread across his car's hood, federal court papers blowing in the wind like discarded trash. The irony was perfect and terrible. The very system he had sworn to uphold was about to reveal just how broken it truly was. The patrol car doors slammed shut with the finality of a judge's gavel. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Morrison dragged Washington through the booking area like a prize catch. Officers looked up from their paperwork, some nodding approval at Morrison's apparent efficiency, others sensing something was off about the whole scene. "What have you got, Morrison?" Sergeant Kelly asked from behind the front desk. His weathered face carried the skepticism of a 20-year veteran who had seen every type of arrest walk through those doors. "Drug investigation," Morrison announced proudly, his chest puffed out with satisfaction. "Caught this one casing houses in the financial district. Suspicious behavior, resisting arrest, the whole package." Washington remained silent, his hands still cuffed behind his back. His expensive suit was wrinkled from sitting on the curb, but his dignity remained intact. He studied the booking area with the careful attention of someone who understood the system from both sides. Stevens entered behind them, carrying Washington's briefcase and scattered belongings. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the station's air conditioning. Everything about his body language screamed discomfort. "Let's get him processed," Morrison continued, steering Washington toward the booking desk. "Run his prints, full background check. I bet this isn't his first rodeo." Sergeant Kelly pulled out the standard intake form, his pen poised over the paperwork. "Name?" "Nathaniel Washington," came the calm reply. Kelly began typing the information into the computer system, his thick fingers hunting and pecking across the keyboard. The database search would take a few minutes to complete, cross-referencing criminal history, outstanding warrants, and any special flags in the system. Morrison paced behind the desk like a proud hunter, regaling other officers with his version of events. "You should have seen this guy's attitude." Acting all superior, like he owned the place, had a briefcase full of legal papers, probably stolen. The computer terminal chimed softly. Kelly's eyes focused on the screen as information began populating the fields. Name, address, date of birth, all standard information flowing across the monitor in neat digital rows. Then a red flag appeared. Kelly blinked hard, certain he was seeing things. He leaned closer to the screen, his face inches from the monitor. The blood drained from his cheeks as he read the classification code twice, then 3 times. "Morrison," Kelly's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Morrison, get over here, now!" "What's the problem, Sarge?" Morrison asked casually, still basking in the glow of his arrest. "System down again?" Kelly's finger trembled as he pointed at the screen. "Look at this. Look at it carefully." Morrison squinted at the monitor, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. The words seemed to swim before his eyes. Judicial officer. Federal District Court. "That's got to be a mistake," Morrison stammered, his voice losing its confident edge. "Run it again. The system's probably picking up some other guy with the same name." Kelly's hands shook as he typed the query again. Same result. The classification was unmistakable, confirmed by multiple databases. The man Morrison had handcuffed and humiliated on a public street was Judge Nathaniel Washington of the United States District Court. Stevens dropped the briefcase, its contents spilling across the floor. Legal documents scattered like fallen leaves, each one bearing the federal court's official seal. Case files marked confidential spread across the linoleum. "Oh, God," Stevens whispered, his career flashing before his eyes. "Oh, my God." The booking area fell silent except for the persistent buzz of fluorescent lights. Other officers stopped their conversations and stared at the trio near the computer terminal. Word spread through the room like wildfire, passed in urgent whispers and wide-eyed glances. Morrison's face had gone completely white. His hands trembled as he stared at the computer screen, reading the same classification over and over. Federal judge, the 2 words that could destroy his career, his pension, his life. "This can't be happening," Morrison muttered, backing away from the terminal. "This can't be real." Washington stood perfectly still, his calm eyes taking in every detail of the room's transformation. Officers who had been joking minutes earlier now stood in shocked silence. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the air itself felt different. Sergeant Kelly approached Washington with the respect reserved for visiting dignitaries. His hands fumbled with the handcuff keys, metal jangling against metal as he struggled to unlock the restraints. "Your Honor," Kelly said, his voice thick with professional courtesy and personal terror, "I am so incredibly sorry. This is a massive misunderstanding." The handcuffs fell away from Washington's wrists with a soft click. He rubbed the red marks where the metal had bitten into his skin, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Morrison stood frozen, watching his world collapse in real time. A federal judge. He had arrested, humiliated, and violated the constitutional rights of a federal judge. The implications crashed over him like a tsunami of consequences. "Officer Morrison," Washington's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His tone was measured, professional, terrifying in its calmness. You have just provided me with a very educational experience about the current state of policing in this city. Stevens began hyperventilating, his breathing rapid and shallow. Other officers backed away from Morrison like he carried a contagious disease. The blue wall of solidarity crumbled in seconds. Kelly grabbed the phone, his fingers fumbling with the numbers. I need to call the chief. And the mayor. And probably the FBI. His voice cracked with each word. Morrison's legs gave out. He sank into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. 15 years of police work, his pension, his reputation, everything was gone. Destroyed by his own prejudice and stupidity. Washington straightened his tie and smoothed his wrinkled suit. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of federal authority. Gentlemen, I believe we need to have a very serious conversation about constitutional rights, police procedures, and the consequences of abuse of power. The silence that followed was deafening. The police station erupted into controlled chaos within minutes of Washington's identity being revealed. Sergeant Kelly's phone call to Chief Rodriguez lasted exactly 47 seconds before the chief's voice could be heard shouting through the receiver from 3 feet away. Nobody moves until I get there. The chief's voice crackled through the speaker. Nobody talks to the media. Nobody does anything. Morrison sat slumped in his chair, staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else. The same hands that had roughly cuffed a federal judge now trembled uncontrollably. Sweat stained his uniform shirt despite the station's aggressive air conditioning. Stevens paced the booking area like a caged animal, his young face cycling through expressions of panic and disbelief. This isn't happening, he muttered repeatedly. This can't be happening. Washington remained perfectly composed, accepting a cup of coffee from a nervous rookie officer who couldn't make eye contact. The judge's calm demeanor only amplified the chaos surrounding him, like the eye of a hurricane watching destruction swirl in every direction. Within 15 minutes, Chief Rodriguez burst through the station doors, his usually pristine uniform disheveled from the frantic drive across town. His face was red with exertion and barely contained rage. Your Honor, the chief approached Washington with the reverence reserved for visiting royalty. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this inexcusable incident. Washington sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Chief Rodriguez, your officers have provided me with valuable insight into your department's current training protocols. The words were diplomatically phrased, but carried the weight of an impending federal investigation. Rodriguez understood immediately that his entire department was now under the microscope. Morrison, my office, now. The chief's voice could have cut glass. Morrison stood on unsteady legs, his face ashen. As he passed Washington, he stopped and opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. What could he possibly say? What apology could cover the magnitude of his actions? I didn't know, Morrison finally whispered. Washington's response was measured and devastating. Officer Morrison, ignorance of my identity doesn't excuse knowledge of the Constitution you swore to uphold. The truth hit Morrison like a physical blow. Even if Washington had been a janitor, a teacher, or unemployed, the violations would have been identical. The badge didn't grant immunity from basic human decency. Rodriguez's office door slammed shut, but the shouting could be heard throughout the station. Words like suspended, investigation, and federal charges drifted through the walls. Other officers found urgent paperwork to complete, avoiding eye contact with anyone involved in the incident. Stevens approached Washington hesitantly, his police academy training warring with his survival instincts. Your Honor, I want you to know that I knew it was wrong. I should have stopped it. Washington studied the young officer with judicial eyes. Officer Stevens, complicity and cowardice often wear the same uniform. What will you do differently next time? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Stevens had a choice to make: continue the cycle of silence or become part of the solution. Within an hour, the station buzzed with incoming calls. The mayor's office demanded updates. The district attorney asked about charges. Internal Affairs launching an immediate investigation. The FBI's Civil Rights Division requested all related documentation. Morrison emerged from the chief's office looking like he'd aged a decade. His badge was gone. His service weapon had been surrendered. The suspension was immediate and without pay pending a full investigation. 15 years, Morrison muttered to no one in particular as he cleaned out his locker. 15 years down the drain. Stevens watched his former partner's downfall with a mixture of sympathy and relief. The toxic influence that had shaped his early career was finally being removed. The department would be different now. It had to be. Washington's phone rang constantly. His daughters called after seeing news reports. Fellow judges offering support. Civil rights attorneys volunteering their services. The incident was already spreading beyond Metro City's borders. A news crew had set up outside the station, their cameras capturing every person entering or leaving the building. The story was writing itself. Respected federal judge arrested by racist cop. Constitutional violations caught on multiple phones. Department forced to confront systemic problems. Rodriguez returned to find Washington finishing his coffee with the same calm he'd maintained throughout the ordeal. Your Honor, Officer Morrison has been suspended pending termination. Officer Stevens will be investigated but has agreed to cooperate fully. The department will implement immediate reforms. Washington stood, straightening his suit one final time. Chief Rodriguez, true justice isn't just about punishment. It's about ensuring this never happens to anyone else. The words carried both forgiveness and warning. The federal courts would be watching Metro City's police department very closely from now on. As Washington walked toward the exit, every officer in the station stood at attention. Respect born from fear, perhaps, but respect nonetheless. The real consequences were just beginning. 3 weeks after the incident, FBI Special Agent Maria Santos stood in Washington's chambers, her briefcase filled with evidence that would reshape Metro City's police department forever. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated stacks of documents, photographs, and video files that told a story much larger than one racist cop. Your Honor, what Officer Morrison did to you was just the tip of the iceberg, Santos explained, spreading photographs across Washington's mahogany desk. Our investigation has uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning 5 years. Washington studied the evidence with judicial precision. Traffic stop statistics showed Morrison had targeted black drivers at a rate 3 times higher than his colleagues. 17 formal complaints had been filed against him, all mysteriously dismissed or buried in bureaucratic red tape. How many victims? Washington asked. 43 that we can verify. Probably more who were too afraid to come forward. Santos pulled out a thick folder. Construction worker Jerome Williams, pulled over 6 times in 2 years. Never charged with anything. Teacher Patricia Johnson, handcuffed in front of her students during a traffic stop. College student Marcus Reed, beaten during an arrest that was later ruled unlawful. Each name represented a story of humiliation and injustice. Washington's incident had given them courage to speak publicly for the first time. The federal judge's treatment had broken the spell of silence that protected officers like Morrison. The criminal trial began on a Tuesday morning in the same courthouse where Washington normally presided. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Morrison would face justice in the building where he had humiliated a federal judge. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had assembled an airtight case. Video evidence from 6 different phones captured every moment of the arrest. Expert witnesses testified about constitutional law and police procedures. Former colleagues described Morrison's pattern of racial bias. Morrison's defense attorney, David Brooks, faced an impossible task. How do you defend the indefensible when it's recorded from multiple angles and witnessed by dozens of people? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Brooks began his opening statement, my client made mistakes. But Officer Morrison is not a monster. He's a 15-year veteran who served this community faithfully until one very bad day. The prosecution's case unfolded like a masterclass in civil rights law. Phone videos played on courtroom monitors showed Morrison's escalating aggression. Audio recordings captured his racist language. Expert testimony explained how each action violated clearly established constitutional rights. Stevens took the stand as the government's star witness, his voice barely above a whisper as he described years of watching Morrison's misconduct. "I knew it was wrong. I should have stopped it. But I was afraid for my career, afraid of being labeled a snitch." His testimony revealed the toxic culture that had protected Morrison for so long, the code of silence that valued loyalty over justice, the supervisors who ignored complaints, the union representatives who covered up misconduct. Washington testified on the third day, his calm recollection devastating in its precision. He described each constitutional violation in legal terms, explaining how Morrison's actions violated clearly established law that any reasonable officer should have known. "When Officer Morrison handcuffed me without probable cause, he violated my Fourth Amendment rights," Washington explained to the jury. "When he subjected me to racial slurs and humiliation, he violated my 14th Amendment rights. These aren't complex legal concepts, they're basic constitutional protections every officer swears to uphold." The defense tried to paint Morrison as a product of poor training and departmental culture. Brooks called character witnesses who described the officer's community service and charity work. None of it mattered when weighed against the mountain of evidence. Dr. Sarah Williams, a criminology expert from Georgetown University, provided devastating testimony about racial bias in policing. Her statistical analysis showed Morrison's stops followed clear patterns of discrimination. Charts and graphs demonstrated how his behavior differed dramatically when stopping white versus black drivers. Officer Morrison didn't suddenly become racist on the day he arrested Judge Washington, Dr. Williams testified. The evidence shows a consistent pattern of bias that his supervisors should have detected and corrected years ago. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Morrison was found guilty on all counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. The federal charges carried serious penalties, up to 10 years in prison per count. Judge Patricia Martinez, a no-nonsense jurist known for tough sentences, delivered Morrison's fate with clinical precision. "Officer Morrison, you violated your oath, betrayed the public trust, and inflicted lasting harm on your victims and your profession. Your actions were not a momentary lapse in judgment, but part of a deliberate pattern of misconduct." The sentence was 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Morrison would also pay $50,000 in fines and was permanently barred from working in law enforcement. Stevens received a suspended sentence and community service in exchange for his cooperation. His police career was over, but he avoided prison time. "Officer Stevens," Judge Martinez noted, "your silence enabled these violations. Silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice." The civil lawsuit against the city moved faster than anyone expected. Washington's legal team, led by civil rights attorney David Thompson, documented not just Morrison's actions, but the systemic failures that enabled them. Mayor Rebecca Johnson, facing political pressure and potential federal oversight, agreed to a settlement that would transform the department. The city paid Washington $2.5 million in damages, but the real victory was in the reforms. A federal consent decree required the Metro City Police Department to implement comprehensive changes. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers. A civilian oversight board gained real authority to investigate complaints. Training programs were overhauled to emphasize constitutional rights and de-escalation. Chief Rodriguez, facing federal pressure and community outrage, announced his retirement. The new chief, Lisa Brooks, was a reformer from outside the department who had successfully transformed police departments in 3 other cities. "We're not just changing policies," Chief Brooks announced at her first press conference. we're changing culture. Every officer will understand that constitutional rights aren't suggestions, they're requirements. The Morrison case became a national symbol of police accountability. Law schools used the videos in constitutional law classes. Police academies showed the footage as an example of how not to conduct traffic stops. Civil rights organizations cited the case in their advocacy for federal police reform legislation. Morrison's conviction sent shockwaves through police departments nationwide. If a federal judge could be treated this way, what did it mean for ordinary citizens? The message was clear. No one was above the law, and no one was beneath its protection. 6 months after sentencing, Morrison sat in federal minimum security prison, his fall from authority complete. The man who had wielded a badge like a weapon now wore an orange jumpsuit and worked in the prison laundry. Justice had been served, but at a cost that extended far beyond one racist cop. The system was finally beginning to change, one case at a time, one conviction at a time, one reformed department at a time. Real justice, Washington reflected, wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. 1 year later, Judge Washington sat in his chambers reviewing case files, but today felt different. Through his window, he could see the same courthouse steps where Officer Morrison had first humiliated him. The marble looked the same, but everything else had changed. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Chief Lisa Brooks entered, carrying a thick folder marked Annual Reform Report. Her face showed the weariness of someone rebuilding an entire institution from the ground up. "Your Honor, I wanted to personally deliver our progress report," Brooks said, setting the folder on Washington's desk. 12 months of reform by the numbers. Washington opened the file and studied the statistics. Traffic stops by race were now proportional to the population. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%. Officer training hours had tripled, with mandatory constitutional law education every 6 months. "What about the culture change?" Washington asked, the question that mattered most. Brooks smiled for the first time in months. Yesterday, Officer Stevens, yes, Morrison's former partner, reported a colleague for using excessive force during an arrest. The complaint was investigated within 48 hours, and the officer was suspended pending review. The transformation Stevens had undergone was remarkable. The young officer who had once stood silently while his partner violated constitutional rights was now a vocal advocate for reform. He led training sessions on bystander intervention, teaching new recruits that silence in the face of misconduct was complicity. Washington's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Sophia. "Dad, saw your interview on 60 Minutes. So proud of how you handled everything. You changed the world without losing who you are." The media attention had been intense but necessary. Washington had given carefully measured interviews, always emphasizing that his experience, while painful, represented thousands of similar encounters that went unrecorded and unpunished. The real heroes, he had told CBS correspondent Anderson Cooper, are the ordinary citizens who refused to look away, who pulled out their phones and demanded accountability. Justice requires witnesses. Morrison was 3 months into his federal sentence, working in the prison library. Letters from his ex-wife mentioned their children's struggles with their father's public disgrace. His fall had consequences beyond his own life, rippling through his family and former colleagues. But Morrison's conviction had also saved lives. The FBI investigation revealed that his escalating behavior was heading toward tragedy. Body camera footage from his final weeks on duty showed increasing aggression and racial hostility that could have turned deadly. Washington picked up a letter from Jerome Williams, the construction worker who had been targeted by Morrison for years. Williams had written to thank the judge for giving him courage to speak up. "Your Honor, when I saw what happened to you, a federal judge in an expensive suit, I realized that if they could do that to you, what chance would people like me have? But your dignity and strength showed me that justice was possible. My lawsuit was settled last week. More importantly, my son isn't afraid of the police anymore." The ripple effects extended far beyond Metro City. The Washington case had become a catalyst for police reform legislation in 12 states. Body camera requirements expanded. Civilian oversight boards gained real authority. Training standards were elevated nationwide. Congress had passed the Federal Police Accountability Act, requiring all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to meet minimum constitutional training standards. The legislation was nicknamed the Washington Standard by civil rights advocates. Washington closed the reform report and looked out his window again. A group of diverse police officers was conducting a community outreach event on the courthouse plaza, talking with citizens instead of intimidating them. Children approached the officers without fear, their parents watching with cautious optimism. His intercom buzzed. "Your Honor, you have a sentencing hearing in 10 minutes. Washington straightened his robes and gathered his thoughts. Today he would sentence a drunk driver who had killed a family of 4. Justice would be served, but it would be measured, proportional, and constitutional. As he walked toward his courtroom, Washington reflected on the journey from that humiliating morning to this moment of quiet triumph. One incident had exposed systemic problems, but it had also demonstrated the power of truth, the strength of witnesses, and the possibility of redemption. The courtroom was full as always, but now Washington saw it differently. Every defendant deserved the same constitutional protections, regardless of their background. Every victim deserved justice, regardless of their status. Every officer deserved training that prepared them to serve all citizens with equal dignity. Standing at his bench, Washington looked out at the packed courtroom. Attorneys, defendants, families, police officers, and citizens. This was democracy in action, messy and imperfect, but striving toward the ideal of equal justice under law. "Court is now in session," Washington announced, his voice carrying the authority earned through adversity and the wisdom gained through suffering. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept discussed in law schools. It was a living principle that required constant vigilance, courage, and hope. The gavel fell, and the work of justice continued. Have you ever witnessed injustice and wondered if one person's courage could really change an entire system? Judge Washington's story proves that it can. When good people stand up, when witnesses refuse to look away, when truth confronts power, transformation becomes possible. What will you do the next time you see injustice? Will you record it, report it, or walk away? Like this video if you believe in equal justice for all. Share it to spread awareness about police accountability. Subscribe for more stories where courage triumphs over corruption. Remember, true justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. The question isn't whether justice will prevail, but whether we'll be brave enough to demand it. Drop a comment below. What role should citizens play in holding police accountable? How can we build trust while ensuring safety? Hit that notification bell and join our community of people who believe that dignity, respect, and constitutional rights aren't negotiable. They're the foundation of a just society. Because in the end, justice delayed may be justice denied, but justice delivered with courage and wisdom can change the world.